Hi, I'm Michael Menduno. I'm the editor-in-chief of InDepth magazine at InDepth.blog, and also an editor with Dan Europe Alert Diver. And I'm here tonight to talk about helium and what is going on with helium and what it may mean for diving. So let me say, originally too, this was an hour-long talk, and I've tried to condense it down, but they've given me a little extra time, but I'm going to probably talk fast. So hang in there, and then at the end, we can either do questions here or move over to the GUE booth, and I can take questions there. So here we go. I'm going to share my slides. Application window. Yep. Share. And then I'm going to go present our view. Right. So hopefully you're seeing. Well, that's a good question. I don't know if you're. Let's go this way. Slideshow. It'll be a little, and then I can go. Yep. Okay. Well, I don't know how to back it. Well, how do I back up? I'm not sure. Here we go. All right, here we go. The future of helium is up in the air. So helium is essential for deep diving. First of all, it's non-narcotic, so we don't have narcosis. And secondly, because it's so light, it greatly reduces the work of breathing. And in fact, helium is the only element that uniquely satisfies these three requirements. We're talking about depth, like when to use helium. Interesting, in the mid 80s, of course, almost everything was deep air at that point. Then in the 1990s, during the tech diving revolution that I got to witness and report on, we were thinking at the time helium beyond 55 to 60 meters, nitrox and air below that, or shallower than that, etc. And today the trend is to use helium shallower and shallower, say helium beyond 30 meters, both for the narcosis as well as the work of breathing with the new density studies. So if you remember if you've been in the helium market or doing any deep diving, just prior to the pandemic, we started seeing helium prices on the rise again. And in some areas, it was difficult to obtain supplies. And this reminisced back, for some of you who are around, to 2011 through 2013, the helium shortage. It was even on the just popular news. Helium prices were up 50 to 100%. Cylinder rentals, from a dive store perspective, and handling costs were up quite a bit. And there were allocation and shortages around the world. Even the International Balloon Association, who knew there was such a thing, noted it, that the prices of helium was going up and up. And so their solution, like in diving, we'll talk about this, was to go to trimix. And that is to mix about 40% air and the rest helium to give you a trimix 860. So at the time, in 2013, this was the cover of Gas World magazine. Helium cliff approaches. There was a shortage all over the world. Helium prices were on the rise. This line here is the US government price for helium. We'll talk about that in more depth, but that's sort of the bottom of the market. And they have this stable pricing. But you can see the spot prices trying to buy helium greatly exceeded that. And the result was there was a shortage. Prices were up by as much as 10 times. So at the time, I started researching this and did this chart looking at the cost of filling double 12-liter cylinders with, say, trimix 1555, and just the costs around costs at different parts of the world, etc. The US at the time was under 150, etc. More recently, in fact, a GUE friend of mine mentioned that, really, if you look at it, helium costs for trimix is about $1 a foot or $3.30 a meter. So every tens of meters you want to go, multiply it times 3.30, and that's what you're going to pay for your gas. So I thought that was kind of cool. At the time, a Nobel laureate physicist, Robert Richardson, said, and this is in 2013, helium is far too cheap. Better to raise the price by a factor of 10 to 20 now to discourage frivolous use. He might have been referring to balloons, rather than a factor of 10,000 in 25 years. So is this the end of open circuit deep diving? What's going on? Where are we headed? So I like to talk about helium in three chunks. Maybe first discuss the discovery and science and production and early uses of helium. As I was researching this, I got really fascinated by it. And then we'll go on to do some diving and a forward market outlook. So what is helium? So it's an element, obviously, 2 neutrons and 2 protons in its nucleus and 2 electrons. It's very, very small. 1 femtometer, which is a millionth of a nanometer, which is a billionth of a meter. So it's a millionth billionth of a meter. Very, very small. And also, it's the second lightest element. Colorless, odorless, tasteless. It's a monatomic atom, unlike oxygen, which pairs O2, N2, etc. Lowest boiling point of any element, and that would be minus 270 degrees C or 452 Fahrenheit. And it exists only as a gas, except under very extreme conditions. So on the periodic table, helium is one of the lightest of the noble gases. These are gases that don't combine with other things. Helium, neon, etc. I jumped forward, sorry about that. So it's the lightest, and we'll talk about that a little more later. Helium is a product of nuclear fusion. Hydrogen atoms are smashed together and they form the helium nucleus, which then attracts electrons. It's most of the helium in the universe was created within the first 3 minutes of the Big Bang that created it all, very hot temperature, etc. And it's the second most abundant element in the universe, behind hydrogen, which is 74%. Fraction of hydrogen in the universe, and helium is about 24%, and all other elements are 2%. However, on Earth, we could call it helium-challenged Earth. Most of Earth's helium has already escaped into space, but it's estimated there's a volume of about 3.8 billion tons. Remember, helium is not a renewable resource. It's a finite resource. In the Earth's atmosphere, if you recall from your diving classes, helium and other trace gases represent, less than 1%, very small. But in terms of volume, again, 3.8 billion tons, and the fraction of helium in the atmosphere is about 0.00052%. So again, very, very small. On Earth, helium is a product of radioactivity. Uranium and other radioactive materials give off particles, and these form the helium. It's estimated that 3 tons escape every year, and that there's about 8 million tons stored in the Earth's crust. And that's how we find it, or found it. We'll talk about that. But it's trapped in natural gas deposits, and that's how it's extracted. It's a byproduct of actually natural gas production, very small fraction. Interestingly, and this point will come up when we talk about the forecast forward, that all the new gas that's being found and developed is from fracking, which is not drilling down into wells, it's cracking rock and all, and that does not yield helium. So that will have meaning for our future as divers. So helium was first noticed in 1868 by a French astronomer, Jules Janssen. He detected this bright line on a spectrogram looking at the frequencies of the sun during a total eclipse. Oops, sorry, I have a sensitive mouse. Oops, going forward. Right, but he assumed it was sodium. The thing is that helium has this wavelength of 587 nanometers, but sodium is very close to that, so easy to mistake. However, the British astronomer, Norman Lockyer, observed the same line and realized it was a new element, and he named it helium for the Helios, the god of the sun. And by note, nitrogen and oxygen were discovered about 100 years earlier. So helium was, a late discovery. In 1882, Italian physicist Luigi Palmieri first detected helium on Earth on Mount Vesuvius in Italy, and then later a Scotch chemist isolated it by treating uranium. And the first real discovery of the gas in a big volume was in May 1903 in the middle of the US in Dexter, Kansas. And they hit this well, Eureka, and it was pouring out, 252,000 kiloliters a day. big thing. And so that night, the town gathered around. They're going to light the well, and it would be celebration because this would be big bucks coming into town. You know, probably kill the tourist industry, but hey. Anyway, so they lit it, and it didn't burn. They ended up doing this statue to it. It's called the wind gas. That's what they called it. They could feel it and sense it, but it didn't burn. So they sent in the geologists who analyzed it, and it turned out it was mostly nitrogen gas. And there was this nitrogen, some methane, some hydrogen, but then this inert residue of about 12%. And when they went further, they discovered it was about 2% helium. Okay, so this was the first known helium place on Earth in big volume, and so this the group of geologists from the university, local university, went around the area. This is right in the middle of the U.S., Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, kind of west. And their conclusion was helium is no longer a rare element, but a common element existing in goodly quantity for uses that are yet to be found. All the wells in the area had helium in it. So it was the only known helium reserve to exist at the time. Very interesting. And on the US, so we're talking about this kind of right in here, part of the US. Yeah. And then a few years later, 1908, Dutch physicists liquefied helium for the first time by chilling it down to, again, 452 Fahrenheit. So, and at the time, again, this had at the University of Kansas, there were 3 glass tubes of helium, and researchers saying, you know what, no practical uses at all. And at the time, small quantities were sold for $90 a liter, or about $2,500 a cubic foot. So it's pricey. So this was the beginning of World War I was rolling around, and the U.S. feared the Germans' technological advantage with the Zeppelin, the lighter-than-air inflatable craft, presented a strategic military advantage for the U.S. And so, as a military imperative, the U.S. Navy sponsored 3 experimental helium plants. And the idea was to fill up these what were called barrage balloons with non-flammable lighter-than-air gas. And so they produced about 5.7 thousand cubic meters of this stuff. And these balloons were floated over cities. They were tethered over cities to make it difficult for enemy aircraft to come in and bomb or shoot at people in the city, which is not a good thing to do. The first helium airship then, again, was created by the government. The Navy made its first flight in 1921. So that was big news. And so at the time, the only known helium reserve on Earth was in the U.S., so that was unique, and it gave us, we had a military imperative to keep it to ourselves, and the U.S. really dominated helium for most of the 20th century. They created the Federal Helium Reserve in that triangle area I showed you, that area, to keep the helium. You see here, I'm frozen. It was stored. There was an underground formation called the Bush Dome Reserve, and they actually pumped it down there. The cost of helium dropped to 10 cents a liter, or about 2 cents a cubic foot. Good time to be a diver. We didn't know about it back then. And then they passed the Helium Control Act of 1927, which forbid the export of helium. So we wanted to keep it as a strategic element. Shortly thereafter, of course, one of the Zeppelins hit a tower and blew up. And so they were forced to use hydrogen instead of helium because they couldn't get helium, so because we kept supplying it. And so there was a whole boom then during World War II. The Navy created about 154 Goodyear airships. A lot of pilots were trained. And at the time, helium prices were 5 cents a 100 liter. Again, good time to be a diver. We'll talk about diving in a little while. In the 50s, the space race, again, helium ended up being a unique element to chill the rocket engines, liquid hydrogen, oxygen fuel in the rocket ships for the space race during the 50s with the Russians. So that was a big deal. And then finally in 1960, they decided to privatize and start selling this reserve. The military had kind of found its use for it, but there was a lot more to gas. And so they created that. Oop, here we go. And they funded building this pipeline to connect all these wells and all. And the idea was, to permit 4 companies to basically manage this and sell the gas, and then the U.S. would benefit from that. And so that created big helium. Air Products, DCP Midstream, Linde, and Praxair. These are globally the big helium companies. Today, the list isn't much different. There have been some acquisitions. Linde bought Praxair, Air Liquide, Matheson, etc. So in 1995, finally, the U.S. was in debt. They had this helium. It wasn't really a military issue anymore. So they decided to start selling it off. The Privatization Act, right? That they would sell off the helium and they would pay off the debt for the whole thing. And eventually the reserve would be dry. It would just be privatized, basically. However, the way they set the prices for it, it was based on their debt, not on market demand or anything. So the U.S. really set a very low ceiling low floor for the pricing. And this was not such a good thing because it discouraged further innovation and exploration. So it had a problem and leads to where we are now. As Richardson said, helium resources could be depleted in 25 years. So let's talk a little about helium and its use in diving. It's got a very interesting history. I've used this paradigm before, but technology tends to move from governments who have big bucks and can do R&D and stuff like that, but down to commercial enterprise, who then take it and do business things with it, and down to consumers eventually, where it scales up, and then consumers end up driving the technology. I mean, look at IT these days, iPhones. Consumers are driving information technology for sure. So the same whole thing has happened in diving. So in the early days, it was actually a little combination of the government and private industry. 1999, some of the researchers at General Electric Research Labs proposed using helium-oxygen mixes to eliminate nitrogen narcosis on deep dives. And they based this on the Meyer-Overton hypothesis of anesthesiology, which says that narcotic potency of gas is inversely proportional. I think it's inverse. I may mix this up to its solubility in fat. Yeah, so helium has low solubility in fat, and so it's not narcotic, whereas things like xenon or oxygen or other things, carbon dioxide, are. And now, of course, there's the new protein theory, different theory of gas-drug interaction. But that's a time for another story somewhere else. So then in 1925, some government, University of California researchers, Sayers and Yount, from the Bureau of Mines, actually, federal, started doing heliox decompression work with small animals. And so out of that, shortly after 1928, the Navy established the Navy Experimental Diving Unit, NEDU, with the goals of developing diving techniques which eliminate the effects of narcosis and develop a means of rescuing crew trapped in submarines. That was the driving force for the military as far as deep diving and why nitrogen narcosis was a problem. They were trying to rescue downed sailors or sailors in downed submarines. And there have been a couple of high-profile incidents in the 20s where all hands were lost. And so the Navy was under a lot of pressure to do something about this. The first helium dive was in 1937. Max G. Knoll dived to 420 feet to 128 meters in Lake Michigan in Illinois using a self-contained heliox helmet and tables that they had developed. And this became Desco Corporation. That same year, Albert Binke and Yarborough conducted heliox chamber dive to 152 meters at the Navy Experimental Dive Unit. Their quote was, "It feels like 100 feet." I'm sure all of you remember that first time at depth on helium and you go, oh my God, I can't believe. Yeah, exactly. So that's what they noticed at the time. And then that year, 1939, it was really the rescue and salvage of the USS Squalus. This was the mission that NEDU had been created for. And in fact, it was the first big operation with heliox diving. They did 248 deep dives, only 2 cases of the bends, and they saved 33 lives, though 26 were lost. So, and that was the point at which the Navy went on and developed their heliox diving tables, which are still from 1939, right, which are still around. So. Then our allies, the Brits, they wanted to get on this helium action. So we loaned them some helium, and in 1948 they began experimenting with etc. Deep diving had some toxicity problems with what they call the Yankee gas. But finally, first-class diver Willard Bullard set a world deep diving record to 163 meters in a lock aboard the HMS Reclaim. So it was the first sub 150-meter dive, spent 7.5 minutes going down, 5 minutes on the bottom. Oops, sorry. And then it took them 8.5 hours to decompress, including 3 hours in the chamber. So maybe the first application of SERDI-O2, though I don't think that was it. So we get to the 60s, which in many respects are really a golden era in diving. Tune on, turn in, drop down. Santa Barbara, oil was discovered off the shore of Santa Barbara in Southern California, and they needed divers to help put these wells there. So at the time, there was a group called Associated Divers, who were known as the King Kongs of oil field diving, based on their ability to do deep air. So a helmeted diver could work at about 250 feet, 73 meters, for about 45 minutes. Less issue with CNS toxicity, again, because they're in an airspace in their helmet, on a tether, et cetera, but that's what they could do. And so they were getting all the business. But the problem was the oil fields were getting deeper. And, you know, this was a very inefficient way of diving. People could only do very short dives at that depth. So abalone diver Danny Wilson had this idea about using helium. And so he conducted a record 122-meter dive in the Santa Barbara using this new lightweight equipment. And the plan was to demonstrate that you could do 60-minute dives to 100 meters, and that was feasible because that's what the oil field needed at the time. This was the picture of his suit. It's at the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum. And anyway, kind of interesting. So it's 122-meter dive, travel gas, Heliox 2080 going down, bottom gas 1090, and he made a deco stop at 52 meters, 36 meters, and then 3-minute increments, O2 for 15 minutes for a runtime of 90 minutes. And the result was that it was a successful demonstration. So him, my dear friend Lad Handelman, and others formed General Offshore Divers, and we were able to beat out Associated Divers for all the oil field work because they could demonstrate to the oil companies they could do the job safer on helium. And in fact, they conducted in that first year about 300 helium dives using tables they had developed, and also began using Trimix. And commercial diving at that point really took over the lead from the Navy in terms of mixed gas diving. They had a broader mission. So it was also that decade was the birth of mixed gas rebreathers, very important. The limiting technology there was oxygen sensors. The early rebreathers used something similar to galvanic, but called polographic sensors. And so they were actually like wet batteries that responded to oxygen, and you had to mix them up and prep them before the dive. So in 1962, Alan Krasberg, founder of General Diving Systems in Scotland, built the first mixed gas rebreather. And then in 1969, sport people were right behind, Walter Stark launched the $2,000 Electrolung aimed at pro divers who had instrument sets. And that, well, there's a whole story there. We won't go into it, but there were some early fatalities. He got bought up by Beckman in South Sally, bought up by Beckman Instruments the next year. It was a big industrial company, had a bunch of high-profile accidents on the rebreather, surprise, you know, at that point in particular, and so they shut it down. So, but the interest in rebreathers and the sensors created a sort of a mini boom in CCR development in the 1970s aimed at the commercial world and military. The other big thing was important in that era, the idea of living and working under the sea. As Ian Kublik said in his book, you know, the story of diving since the beginning is a story for the search for extended bottom time. And of course, living under the sea was sort of the ultimate in that. So there was Jacques Cousteau. This is a picture from him, one of the Conshelf projects. For those who are around will remember that, to go successively deeper into the sea using helium, Heliox atmospheres. Here they are underneath. And of course, the Navy was interested in the same thing. They had the Man in the Sea program with 3 different sea labs, pioneered by this guy, Captain George Bond, who's really one of the fathers and mothers of they were fathers, saturation diving back in the day. etc. And the Man in the Sea program. First was Sea Lab 1 in Bermuda. They were going to spend a month underwater, but got halted after 11 days due to tropical storms at 58 meters. Man in the Sea 2, Sea Lab 2, was in La Jolla Canyon, stationed at 62 meters. They had 3 teams, 15 days each. And of course, astronaut Scott Carpenter came, and he was going to spend 30 days there for a record. It was called the Tilton Hilton because it didn't sit on the seabed quite right, and so it tilted. And this was the site of the world's most famous subsea call from astronaut Scott Carpenter to then President Lyndon B. Johnson of the U.S. It's on YouTube. You can see the link down at the bottom, or you can Google for it. But it's pretty interesting. And of course, Scott Carpenter had helium, voice, and it's pretty funny between the operators and Lyndon Johnson. This was before the era of mobile phones, so they had to have operators set it up. So anyway, pretty cool. Finally, Man in the Sea 3, it was going to be in San Clemente, a really deep project, 185 meters, 600 feet, 5 teams of 9 divers, 12 days each. However, there were problems with the habitat. It began to leak as they were lowered down to put the pressure, and so aquanauts were dispatched to repair it. It was the first mixed gas rebreather fatality. Astronaut Barry Cannon went into convulsions and drowned. Sorry. Checklist alert. It turned out there was no barrel line in his scrubber, so he was diving on an empty scrubber, and the CO2 got him. So, first rebreather fatality on mixed gas rebreathers. It was also the era of the first saturation dives conducted by Westinghouse at Smith Dam, and that whole first concept had been proposed by Albert Benke in 1942. And so this is, of course, where people live under pressure. They go down once, compress, work at depth, and at the end of their tour, they are decompressed all at once. They live in a chamber. Also with and these were helium because they're deep. Also with helium, we have the basically HPNS, high pressure nervous syndrome. These were first called helium tremors and discovered by Peter Bennett, who went on to found DAN. And then in '68, Braun coined the term high pressure neurological or nervous syndrome. And this is under rapid compression with helium. You get too hyped up and shake and have problems. Dr. Bennett showed that trimix, adding a little nitrogen to kind of narc you out a bit, like taking a bong hit on that cold helium at depth to mellow you out, and later Comex, of course, pioneered using hydrogen and helium mixes with oxygen to ameliorate HPNS. So, and today, interesting on SAT diving, dive contractors are eliminating mixed gas bounce dives like tech divers, surface to surface dives altogether for safety reasons. The U.S. Coast Guard now mandates if you're diving beyond 90 meters, you have to be in SAT. And BP and some of the big oil companies are saying if you're beyond 37 meters, which is the density where nitrox becomes a problem, or air, 37 meters, you need to be in saturation. So tech divers and military divers are going to be the only ones doing surface-to-surface bounce dives. So we talked about government, commercial, and now on to consumer. How am I doing on time? I'm running over, of course. We'll get through this. Summer of Love, around the 60s, and in South Africa, 1968, actually, BSAC divers, Raleigh Nyman, Robertson, and Vanderwall, conducted a trimix dive in a silent pool in Rhodesia to 107 meters. They were diving trimix, 16% oxygen, 36% helium, maximum PO2, 1.85. Here's the quote: the best balance between oxygen tension, narcosis, and cost. Quite safe for a short stay. Now, there would be people who would argue with me on Deep Air to say, yeah, you can, not a problem. And it probably isn't for a very short stay. Helium Underground. Next, we flash forward to 1970 when R. Hal Watts, famous Hal Watts from Professional Scuba Association, along with deep diver, conducted a 110-meter body recovery dive at Mystery Sink. He was diving heliox, actually 1684, so PO2 of 1.9, and he got severely bent. And so that kind of put the kibosh on helium, or the sport divers, cave divers thinking about helium. for another decade. And in fact, it wasn't until 1980 till Dale Sweet dived Dive 2 in Florida to 110 meters to a place called the Flag Room. He put a flag in it. Sheck Exley later the following week went in, and it's called his Salute the Flag dive, because Sheck went in on air and saluted the flag and got out. This was before he started, well, while he was still doing big wing stuff. 1983, Joko Hassemeyer in France also started doing deep dives, him and Sheck, 200 meters. Then 1987, we'll call it Springs Project with Bill Stone, dives to 98 meters he was using Heliox. I think, yeah, so was Hassemeyer. And then Sheck started using Trimix, also working with Bill Hamilton, and then Parker Turner, Bill Gavin, and the group's founders of the Woodville Cars Planes Project, WKPP, also were pioneering some of this early helium use. And this really led to the technical diving revolution, the adoption of mixed gas diving by mixed gas technology by sport divers. I turned the coin. I started at the time. I was calling it the tech diving revolution because it struck me as very parallel to the personal computer revolution, PC revolution, in the 1970s, where small computers were the technology was being scaled down to consumers to take in a new direction. And that's what was happening with mixed gas technology. This is Jim King, Larry Green, Dustin Klesse, and some others. I can't remember your names, I'm sorry. At Dive 2, some of their gear, doing some exploration dives there. So tech today, here we are, open circuit tech. Let's talk, and because that's what we're concerned with. So let's talk about where the global healing market is today, what it means for tech divers. So you might be surprised to learn that helium is actually, even though it's a very essential gas, a uniquely essential gas, it's only about $10 billion in annual sales globally. There are 19 helium refineries on the world, and production typically runs at about 95% production capacity. So what happened back in 2011 and 13? It was a perfect storm surrounding helium. There was continued growth in demand. Key production plants went offline and some new plants were delayed. There was geopolitical unrest in Algeria, which was a producer. The US government threatened to close the reserve, and they had been selling this stuff at really low prices, so no one was doing exploration. So as a result, things tanked. Basically the demand greatly exceeded supply, and basically prices went up. So that's what happened back then. After that, markets stabilized. There are some new plants in Qatar and Big Piney in the US. And the US decided they passed some legislation called the Helium Stewardship Act of 2013 to continue sales of helium reserves, but to raise the prices more to market rates. So what happened last year? Basically, if you remember, Saudi embargoed Qatar, and Qatar is like the second or third biggest producer in the world. So that put the kibosh and started sending prices up, and that's what happened. The pandemic has So the pandemic has sort of softened that for the time being, softened some demand, but it's going to go back up, and that's what I want to talk about next, sort of a forward outlook. I'm almost done here. So if you look at helium reserves, or what I believe, these are two scenarios. Here we are now in 220, so right around in here. So there's still a lot of helium left on the planet, okay? However, getting it is complex, and access and commercializability is complex due to several factors. First, it's inelastic demand. Like in diving, there is no other element that can do deep diving. Without helium, we're screwed, basically, unless, we invent gills or something. Second, it's scarce. It's a byproduct of natural gas production. And so it's only profitable as long as gas is profitable to extract. Prices have been kept artificially low by the sell-off of the U.S. Strategic Reserve, which are still going on. And a lot of it is just long-term private contracts, so that it's a very opaque market. You can't really see what prices and all are and all. And there's a structurally fragile supply. It's only controlled by a few oligopolies. So in fact, 5 major facilities control 80% of the world's helium. It's the BLM storage in Kansas, LaBarge in Wyoming, Hugoton in Texas, and then in Algeria and Qatar. So what's the outlook going forward? Let's talk about supply and demand. Basically, these green bars are helium supply by country. And these are three demand scenarios. Zero growth, you'll see that supply sort of starts exceeding demand in 2024, 25. 1.5% growth, and it's barely keeping up. Shortages, pressure on prices. 3% growth, which it's been, if that from up until 2018 and 19, with the pandemic slowed it. If that continues, there's going to be this huge shortage. So that's on the supply side, right? More demand than supply. And where's the demand coming from? Well, breathing applications are only 2% of all helium demand. So that $10 billion, we're just a very, small, well, can't look at it that way. 2% of breathing applications are us. Everything else is medical, etc. And it's unique in all these uses. So magnetic resonance, MRIs, that's a huge use right now. And that's, with our health crisis, we may see more of that. Manufacturing for silicon chips, memory chips, etc., optics. It's also being used in disk drives right now. So helium, so demand in medical and IT is going to just continue to grow. And as demand grows, that means price goes up. So let's look at the supply side of things. The future of helium is tied to natural gas. It's a byproduct. And energy companies make more in one day of natural gas production than they make in a whole year of helium production. So it's sort of, it's not a big focus of theirs. Natural gas, for example, is $1 trillion per year industry. So from an energy company perspective, helium production is more of an aggravation, than a driver. So this portends poorly for us. Also, as I mentioned earlier, more and more natural gas production is coming from shale gas, more and more, and that does not produce any helium. So long-term prospects, there's a couple. Qatar 3 was supposed to start this year, but it's been delayed. The Russian Amur fields are supposed to start next year. Maybe they will. There's some smaller projects in Western Canada by my good buddy, Guy Shockey out there. Hey, Guy. And in Poland. So the big one is Russia's Amur fields. It's said to maybe hold a third of the world's helium reserves, so it's a big deal. However, there are real challenges to getting it started, even difficult to access, little or no infrastructure. Helium's difficult to transport, limited shelf life, there are risks. It's much more costly to produce. And then the pandemic on top of it. So the view is now that the Amur fields are going to get pushed out. So look at what this means. Even at zero demand growth, we're going to see supply just meeting, demand. So prices just barely there. And if any shocks to the system, what's going to happen? Prices are going to go up. This is from a Praxair executive I talked to. I don't think we will ever see an oversupply. We'll always be trying to catch up. So what does this mean for tech divers? Helium prices, 18 to 25 cents a liter, $5 to $7 a cubic foot. I think even though some organizations, the training is worth paying for and all, I think this will eliminate open circuit scuba, really. By all practical means, which means that for doing any deep diving or really long diving, etc., we're all going to be, deep diving certainly, we're all going to be on rebreathers because that's the only thing we'll be able to afford. So I want to thank you. How did I do on time? Well, I had 10 minutes over. If you have any questions, I'll suggest you. Let me try to take them right here. Stop sharing. Let's see what happens here, and then I go to the stage. Anyone here? Hi. Scott. Hi, Scott. Hi, Scott. I should have. Yes, I should have had a little. I don't have any helium here at the house right now. I should have had some helium and breathed it and started my presentation that way. Yeah, that would have been good. So thank you for sticking around, everyone. If there's any questions, I'll answer them. If not, I may be the only one here at this point. Let's get drink time. Oh, thanks, Scott. Oh, thank you. I hope it wasn't too incoherent. I don't have to type back. I can just talk. That's right. You type with me and I talk back. So I hope it wasn't too boring. I find this stuff really interesting, though. Yeah. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott. Thank you. Anyway, have a good evening. It's dinner time here, actually. It's 6:40, so I am going to go eat dinner if there are no more questions. And hope you have all good evening. Thank you, Scuba.Digital, for putting this on and getting this all together and letting us have some fun and share stuff. And yeah, I'm really appreciative and grateful. Thank you.